summarizes a number of examples of ideological elements in work organizations that you'll typically find in American places of work, American organizations. Again, the overriding importance of rationality as a theme, at least in the ideology of organizations. That harkens back to Weber for us, if you recall. You're welcome. And the interesting thing about rationality, among them, is this realization, I think it's a realization, and I mentioned it before last week, I think, about Herbert Simon's concept of bounded rationality, that as human beings, we're limited in our ability to perceive, we're limited in the amount of information that we can process, even with computers available to us. It's not hard for a computer to crunch a bunch of numbers, but for us to be able to make sense of the result and what it might mean in terms of biases that are built into the analytic system, well, that's a different story as well. We're limited in our time that we can attend to issues, particularly in the workplace. And yet, rationality, not bounded rationality, not limited rationality or limits on rationality, but rationality itself, an important element of the ideological part of organizational culture for so many organizations. Performance-oriented management ideology is very much a part of American organizational culture now. Not so much for folks who are being managed, but for those folks who are white collar as opposed to blue collar, for example. Now, is anybody familiar with social Darwinism as particularly a Western? It's not just Western, but it's been thought of primarily as a Western thought system. What's that? Go ahead. Survival of the fittest, which is interesting enough, was never mentioned by Darwin himself. Social Darwinism is somewhat inappropriately named in honor of, oh boy, I don't want to use the word in honor there, but named after somehow, Charles Darwin. It's the effort by people to argue that the biological evolution somehow explains the rise and fall of individuals collectively or of society. I believe it was Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher, who actually coined the term survival of the fittest. There's no evidence that suggests that Charles Darwin ever did so. But yeah, the notion here is that just as there's competition in the animal world and that some species die out, then in culture and society, human society, there's competition among groups of people and there's competition among individuals, and that over time those people who have the more socially valued skills, knowledge, abilities, etc., will over time rise to the top, and those that have less desirable social skill sets will inevitably begin to settle toward the bottom of the reward structure that's available within any kind of society. Now, it's not a surprise that most of the prominent social Darwinists were themselves of the elite. Right? It's kind of interesting that Charles Darwin, one of the measures that Charles Darwin would use by way of determining what different species was actually more was surviving, was more effectively exploiting its environment, was actually its numbers. Now think about that. If you're talking about poor people versus the elite, who tends to have the greater numbers? The poor people. If this were a strict application of Charles Darwin's thinking about evolutionary mechanisms, then we would argue that it's poor people who are somehow biologically superior, because count them. There are many, many more of them than there are the elite. But so that seemed to be a kind of an arithmetic that was missing on the social Darwinists, who tended to view superiority in terms of cultural elements, prestige, power, accumulation of wealth, etc., and not in terms of sheer numbers at all. But a social Darwinist argument would be that if you were to redistribute let's say, all money that exists within, all wealth that exists within a society, so that every adult member of that society had an equal share at point one, then at some point in the future, guess what would happen? From a social Darwinist perspective, those who had started out rich would be rich again. Those who had started out before the redistribution of wealth would be poor again, because inevitably the cream rises to the top, and the cream is defined as those socially valuable skill sets, value sets, etc., that did have biological roots. The argument here is that this was immutable. Social Darwinists, for example, would typically be very, very critical of us and of our profession. Very, very critical of efforts at social reform or social engineering, because this, for some of them, would represent an effort to kind of fiddle with God's plan for the distribution of not just wealth, but also of intelligence, of energy, of morality, etc. And yet, within the American Work Organization, there's the notion that organizations competing against one another is good for the environment, it's good for the people, it's good for the economy, and ultimately it helps to thin the herd of organizations that are structurally weak or managerially inefficient or whatever. Now, competing with social Darwinism in an interesting way was this industrial betterment movement that took place around 1880 to around 1920 or so, where the notion was that employing organizations had a responsibility and could profit by efforts to help elevate the education and the betterment of the employee. And that through doing that, organizations were serving their society better, and that were ultimately also improving their effectiveness, the contribution they could make to the society by elevating the skills and the knowledge and the morality of their own employees. An interesting variation on this would be the employee assistance programming. Because isn't employee assistance in some respects an effort to identify people in the workforce that have problems, and then to provide social, emotional, psychiatric, or other kind of services to the employees so that they can be better able to work, but also happier and more successful as individuals. We have scientific management. We've talked a bit about scientific management, Taylorism, etc., Theory X. But at the same time, we have a strong set of beliefs in the American ideological culture of work that emphasizes the importance of human relationships, not just for the kind of holistic ethical welfare of individuals, but also as an opportunity to glean from workers or from subordinates in a workforce their knowledge, their commitment, and their skills toward the bottom line of increased profits through better programming, better product. And then we have this emphasis on the quality of work life that's increasingly important within the American culture. Right? We spend almost half of our waking time at work or in work organizations. Right? Why should that be a noxious experience on people? Why can't it be something that we enjoy or that's also important to us? The extent to which it's important to us, hearkening back to industrial employment or industrial betterment. So those are elements of the ideology of workforce. Now, when we're talking about cultural forms in organization, somewhat significant transition here, when we move from the substantive world of ideology and we begin to move to an examination of actual behavior in organizational culture, what are some of the things that we might begin to look for? Okay. And this particular slide gives us some clues as to what to look for. There you go. Now, every culture, whether we're talking about something of a national or transnational form, or if we're talking about something that's quite narrow and specific like an organizational one, is highly symbolic. Highly symbolic. Matter of fact, some anthropologists approach culture as primarily an examination of symbols. And so it's important to think about what symbols are. First of all, a symbol is something that's arbitrary. It's something that stands for something else. It has a culturally created and extrinsic meaning. The American flag. Right? American flag, and a very, very important symbol to many, many people, both within and outside of the United States. Right? Now, if 200 years ago we had chosen a flag with the colors of yellow and green on it, chances are it would still have much the same emotional loading that it has now when we look at the stars and stripes that are red, white, and blue. Because we would have grown up with, we would have been socialized to basically the same set of meanings as to what that flag represents, what it is symbolic of. And people in other cultures, other societies, looking at that green and yellow American flag would have much the same feelings about it, thoughts about it, because they too would have grown up with the same set of expectations. The color, the shape of the flag, arbitrary, the meanings associated to it, not arbitrary at all. Very intentional. That's the importance of a symbol. Right? Very intentional assignment of extrinsic meanings to it. So, for example, has anybody ever, you learn another language, okay? And at some point in time, not in class probably, but some friend, easier now to do with Google than before, learns how to swear in the other language, right? Tremendous fun. Tremendous fun when you start learning what the good swear words are in another language. And so you begin to practice them. So you get the pronunciation right, and you get the accents right, you even get to do it right, right? And it's so artificial. It's so artificial. It has none of the same expressiveness, has none of the same kind of emotional catharsis when you're swearing in another language until you really begin to learn the language, or you really begin to use that term so commonly that it now becomes a substitutable symbol for the kind of vocalizations that are part of your native tongue. Right? I'm going to make up a word. I'm not going to use a real one for fear of offending somebody, and because this part of it's going to be taped. All right? So it's kind of another word. Zark, that's a good one. Thank you very much, right? So Zark is Polish. Zark is Polish for the worst word in English that you happen to use in your language. Okay, so say Zark. Go ahead, say Zark. Zark. Right? You embarrassed about saying Zark? You probably aren't. What's the worst word in English language that you typically use? Thank you. Thank you. Right? Yeah, you comfortable saying Zark, weren't you, in class? You weren't comfortable saying the other thing, were you? All right? Now, my bet would be that if this were an honest-to-goodness language symbol, or you chose to make it this, and you started using Zark every time you hit your hand with a hammer or something like that, that after some period of time, Zark would begin to have the same kind of emotional associations and cognitive associations for you that that other word that you didn't want to use, that you didn't want to share, would have. All right? An entirely arbitrary thing, but it becomes imbued with meaning. That's the key thing about symbols. And so symbols can be represented by physical things. They can be represented by things that we say. They can be represented by things that we do. Right? My mom told me about, my mom is 86 years old or something like that. Before World War II, you know how she was taught in school to say the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Now, a few years later, fascism rose its ugly head in Europe, in Italy, and in Germany. What were they doing? They were doing that. So what were American school kids told to do? This instead. A symbol, right? But one that began to have unfortunate associations with that, so the symbol was changed. So symbol can be behavioral as well. Right? I think it's interesting to look at uniforms. And it's not just military uniforms, or it's not just a uniform for the UPS guy, or it's not just somebody who's working in food service or whatever it is, right? But just look at your fellow students on campus, at the messages that they're attempting to convey in the clothes that they wear. And when I was an undergraduate, it was like the height of the hippie movement, right? And so to see people who were self-styled hippies trying to communicate that sense of self to others by the careful use of symbols, tie-dyed shirts, ratty and frankly frequently dirty jeans. Mine aren't ratty and they're not all that dirty. Use of sandals or barefoot, long hair. Uh-oh. This is becoming a little bit uncomfortable. Right? In my old age, I guess I'm turning hippie. But the fact is that there are a variety of behavioral kind of manifestations that people use even to communicate themselves. But it's through symbols. Now see, if you're a part of the culture, you read into those behaviors. You read into those things meanings that you're probably not even aware that you're doing because you're so thoroughly imbued within the culture itself. Now, if you're entirely alien to the culture, you don't even read anything of that into it. Or you might read your own cultural kind of meanings into it, realizing, perhaps, that that's really an awkward, inappropriate thing to do, or sometimes not aware of that at all, and making judgments about meaning, and about people, and about intent on an entirely unrelated set of cultural symbols, right? The ugly American at his or her worst. So what are some of these things that we might look for in organizations? Well, what objects are there around, right? What in an organization are presented as ways of trying to create impressions of the organization itself to others? Well, for one thing, it could just be the building, How much money sometimes goes into creating a building with intentional kind of meanings to it. Religious organizations are great about that kind of thing. Great big cathedrals or whatever, right? Some of them have great big glass windows because that has special meanings to them, right? Some of them it's the ornate symbolism that exists within the organizations, or within various religious kind of niches there. You know who also tends to be very, very good at the objects that they use? Political organizations tend to be very, very good at those kind of things, particularly in totalitarian regimes. Professional and major college sports programs could be very, very good about that. Can you imagine going to someplace like, New England Patriot Stadium or something like that? I'm a Browns fan. We don't even go there anymore, even imaginatively. But if you've won a Super Bowl, to have that trophy right there. University of Southern California has a really, really nice building they've devoted toward kind of celebrating their athletic success. And so they have the Heisman Trophy that are still available to the university on display there. Those are important symbols of of athletic excellence. So what are the objects? What are the settings? Who are the performers? Who are the people? How are they dressed? How do they comport themselves? What kind of meanings are they attempting to convey to one another? I think we've talked before that back in the 50s and maybe into the 60s, General Motors, its major headquarters in Detroit, that depending upon where you were within the managerial executive hierarchy, gave you permission to wear different kind of shirts if you were male. So if you were at the lowest rungs of supervision and management, you were confined to white shirts. White shirts. If you got up higher, then you could maybe wear a white shirt that had a little bit of pinstriping to it. If you got up higher, then you could wear pastel shirts. In other words, there was a uniform. I talk about uniforms. There was a uniform that designated a hierarchy in terms of authority, in terms of power and prestige within the organization. All right? Who are the performers? How do they comport themselves? What's the language that's used? think in terms of your human service work. Think about the jargon that you use. Right? Think about the humor that's used. Police, fire departments frequently use what's called black humor, right? A very dark kind of humor that might be very, very offensive to people because they wouldn't find any kind of humor in it unless you were thoroughly imbued within the culture and began to use that kind of cultural expression as a way of distancing yourself, even if it was something emotionally, even if it was something that you're going to have to see and deal with daily, and to begin to place yourself a bit apart from it and use the use of laughter to relieve some of that stress through the humor. Songs, right? How many of you were in Girl Scouts? Right? Do you have any songs? Yeah, lots of songs, right? You know, if you're in the military, you got songs, right? Okay. What are the narratives? I've got a narrative that's going to blow your socks off in just a second. But what are the stories that people tell? You know, the kind of everyday things. What are the sagas that people tell? These are heroic stories. Probably, maybe it could be the founder of the organization or an exemplar who's a practitioner of whatever art or science happens to be a part of the organization. And what are the values that are embedded within those particular kind of stories? I'm not going to tell you which university it is because, again, this thing is being recorded. But at a university with which I was thoroughly familiar, there was a story of one of their doctoral students who later went on to be one of their own professors. Right? And the story was conveyed to me by the dean of that particular university as a way, I believe, of clarifying the importance of research at that particular university, that particular department. All right? Now, the story goes, and I heard it from several people who all confirmed that it was true, so I would put it under the sagas category as opposed to the myth, which is constructed artificially. Strong elements of untruth here, although creative. Sagas are essentially true, right? That this individual, while working on her dissertation, was just finishing the thing up. I mean, this is a monumental effort. She was working on the last chapter, really getting down to the last few pages, and needed a citation. Couldn't find a citation for a particular fact or quote or data. She had just become a new mother only weeks before, and her newborn was upstairs in the summer, asleep. Newborns sleep a lot. So she made a choice. She could either wait until the baby awoke, until hubby returned, until the opportunity presented itself for her to run off to the library to get the datum that she needed, or she could make sure that baby was fine, run off to the library quickly, locking the door behind her, get what she needed from the library, and come back. Now, you know where this is going, don't you? She chose the latter. So she went up, made sure baby was fine, baby was still asleep, got in the car, locking the door behind her, ran off to the library and got the information she needed. And in the process of getting that information, she ran across some more information she didn't have. That was exciting. So she used some additional resources that were there at the library. That was terrific. She was really even developing her dissertation beyond what she thought she could. Right? 4-5 hours later, she returned. And as she was walking up the front steps to her house, she heard her baby cry and remembered that she was a mother. That dean told me that with a smile on his face and pride evident in his voice as an example of the dedication of faculty at that school in social work toward their research agenda. As a new father at the time, I was appalled. Absolutely appalled that a social work faculty, a social work dean, would use this saga and not recognize what it meant in terms of child neglect and in terms of what it means toward much more profound core values in social work. You getting some idea why I'm not mentioning the college's name right now? That's a narrative that tells a powerful story about values that are important to an organization. I would trust that in the Department of Social Work at East Tennessee State University, you will never hear that story described for any of our faculty, because that's not part of our value system here. And then practices. What are the various rituals and taboos? What are the things that we do, the things that we don't do, that again are largely artificial? The meaning is extrinsically provided, but that convey explicit or implicit messages to people within an organizational culture. All right? Spirit Day. Yeah, yeah. Civility Week. Kind of neat. Well, let's look at these practices, and my goodness, look how easy it is to read that. Good luck, Zion.
Yeah.
However, there are handouts. And for folks who might be looking at this video who aren't in class today, this handout that I'm distributing now is available on your D2L site. There you go. Cultural Rights and Organizations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Now, just for what it's worth, the first three of these, passage, degradation, and enhancement, passage, degradation, and enhancement as types of rights, address rights primarily with regard to individuals within the system, individuals within the organization. The second set of three, renewal, conflict reduction, and integration, speak primarily to group phenomena. And unfortunately, we don't see the third one down there, and I'm not going to make the effort to do it because you can't read it probably anyway on the film. Speak to change. And these are creation, transition, and parting. Now, notice the example of passage. We're talking about changes in role or status. Particularly, we're talking about entry many times into a system. So we might be talking about, let's say, a induction into the military, becoming part of the military, going through basic training, etc. What might be a manifest expressive consequence of this? Well, facilitating a transition of roles for persons for whom the roles are new to them. Changes of identity that are involved in that kind of thing. But notice a latent expressive consequence here that's possible, and that is minimizing variation in performance of roles across people who are new to those roles, right? And helping people reestablish balance in ongoing relationships as they move into a much more hierarchical, much more structured environment. Degradation, interesting type of right in organizations. An example of that might be firing or replacing employees. Manifest expressive consequence, well, dissolving social identities, separating people from sources of power that they've enjoyed and exercised in the past. Now, the act of firing them will separate them from the legitimate power that they would have had as an incumbent in that position. But to the extent that this becomes a right that is acknowledged within the organization, it's also a method of removing from them the sources of informal power that they might have had and been able to enjoy in the past, and denying that to them as they move into the future with the organization or as they move outside of the organization. Now notice possible here, latent expressive consequence. Well, publicly acknowledging that problems exist, giving people the opportunity to discuss their details. By the way, also showing people within the organization that the organization addresses problems. I know of certain organizations that seem absolutely incapable of recognizing publicly and separating themselves from people who are noxious in their behavior as executives. So many human service organizations just seem to be willing to tolerate incapable, incompetent, or abusive executives. And part of that has to do with embedding in the political success these people have had with their boards of directors, quite at the expense of client welfare and the welfare of hardworking individuals in the bowels of the organization. It's a real shame. You can read these things as well as I can read them to you, right? So I'm not going to do that. The importance here is to demonstrate that there are a variety of behavioral forms that organizations employ that are symbolic in their meaning. They're largely symbolic in their origin, but they provide very, very important messages to people who are sensitive enough, read that, proficient within the organizational culture to derive meaning from those kinds of things. In what wide variety of ways do organizations invite change? In what wide variety of ways do organizations interpret change as a threatening aspect of their experience and resist it? To what extent are organizations and organizational culture open to the introduction of new types of members to their organization? Right? Women, people with color, people who are not Judeo-Christian in terms of their religious background, people whose second language, perhaps at best, is English, and whose primary language is some other tongue. Right? People who celebrate different kind of holidays, people who mourn different kind of losses, people whose approach to work is different than that which has been historic and continuous within the United States. To what extent does culture invite or discourage even the entry of such individuals into the workforce? And what's our role, not just as social workers, but as people within a country that claims accommodation and acceptance of diversity? What's our role in facilitating this process? And if you're a new member, if you're one of these people who's new to the kind of cultural forms, what's your responsibility as a person who's entering that to make yourself culturally sensitive and culturally competent to the norms that exist already, that have already been informally negotiated by whatever level of diverse people have inhabited that organization or that culture, that society before you? Those are the questions that I think that we need to ask. Right? But I'm not going to offer you answers to that. Your text does a nice job of beginning to present some of the basic information, the basic kind of things to think about with regard to diversity in organizations. We've now dealt with this profoundly important concept of organizational culture to some extent in a way that your text does not. And so let's leave it at that at this point in time and call it a night. What do you say? Thank you.